There's something fundamentally different about grief when it transforms you into a monster, when the love you had for your daughter becomes the thing that justifies destroying others, when sorrow stops being an emotion you feel and becomes the bedrock of your entire existence, reshaping the landscape around you for over a century. Mother Miranda from Resident Evil Village is that kind of grief, made manifest, made monstrous, made into something that devours entire communities while wearing the mask of salvation. Tonight we're going deep into the psychology of a woman who loved her daughter so completely that when that daughter died, she couldn't accept the basic reality of death itself. And instead of processing that loss, instead of moving through grief into some kind of acceptance or meaning making, she spent over 100 years trying to reverse it, creating generations of suffering in her wake. This is going to be a full psychological breakdown of Mother Miranda. We're examining her grief pathology, her narcissistic injury, her God complex, her dissociative relationship with time and morality, all of it. I'll be using actual clinical frameworks here, not surface observations. We're talking about complicated grief disorder, pathological mourning, narcissistic personality structure, and what happens when someone with considerable intelligence and zero emotional regulation gets access to supernatural power. I'll rate certain psychological traits on severity from 1 to 5, where 1 is mild and 5 is as extreme as it gets, completely consuming the person's entire existence. So get comfortable, settle in, maybe close your eyes if you want. We're about to dissect what happens when a mother's love curdles into something unrecognizable, when protection becomes predation, when the desire to save one child justifies destroying hundreds of others. The wound that never closed. Let's start with the event that defines everything else. In 1919, during the Spanish flu pandemic that killed millions worldwide, Mother Miranda lost her 10-year-old daughter, Eva, to the disease. Just that sentence alone contains multiple layers of trauma that we need to unpack, because understanding Miranda's psychology requires understanding the specific nature of this loss and what it meant to her identity. First, the historical context matters. The Spanish flu was catastrophic, sudden, indiscriminate. It killed between 50 and 100 million people globally in just 2 years. Entire families were wiped out. Communities were devastated. The speed and scale of death was incomprehensible, and medical science had almost nothing to offer. You watched your loved ones sicken, struggle to breathe, drown in their own lungs, and you could do absolutely nothing to stop it. That kind of helplessness, that complete inability to protect or save, creates a specific flavor of trauma. It's not just grief over loss, it's rage at your own powerlessness, at the universe's indifference, at the fundamental unfairness of watching a child suffer while you stand there useless. Second, Ava was 10 years old, not an infant who never gained full personhood in the parent's mind, not a teenager developing independence and separation. 10 is old enough to have a distinct personality, interests, dreams, a relationship with her mother that's reciprocal and complex. Miranda knew Ava as a person, not just as an extension of herself, and that makes the loss more psychologically devastating in some ways. She's not mourning potential or fantasy. She's mourning a specific human being she knew intimately, whose absence leaves a shaped hole in her daily existence. Third, and this is speculation, but psychologically reasonable speculation, Eva appears to have been Miranda's only child. The historical records we get through the game never mention other children, and Miranda's obsessive focus on Eva suggests she was singular, irreplaceable, the sole focus of maternal attachment. This matters because parents of multiple children, while grieving any lost child terribly, still have other relationships demanding their attention and care. They have to keep functioning for their surviving children. But a parent who loses their only child loses not just that relationship, but their entire identity as a parent. The role that structured their life, gave them purpose and meaning, disappears. What are you when you're a mother with no child? The question is existentially destabilizing. Miranda's response to Eva's death was to attempt suicide. She descended into the cave system beneath her village, intending to die from exposure, to simply lie down in the dark and let herself fade away. This tells us several things about her pre-mold psychological state. She had no other attachments strong enough to keep her alive. No husband mentioned, no other family, no community ties that mattered more than reunion with her dead daughter. Her entire world had narrowed to Eva. Continuing to exist felt pointless and unbearable. This is what psychologists call complicated grief, and in Miranda's case, it would certainly qualify as prolonged grief disorder if we're using DSM criteria, though obviously the supernatural elements complicate clinical diagnosis. Prolonged grief disorder involves intense yearning for the deceased, preoccupation with thoughts of them, difficulty accepting the death, feeling that life is meaningless without them, and these symptoms persisting beyond what's culturally expected for mourning, typically at least a year. Miranda's grief never progressed beyond this acute phase. Even a century later, her entire existence remains organized around the loss of Eva, the yearning to bring her back, the inability to accept death as final. But here's where it gets psychologically complex. Miranda's suicide attempt was interrupted by her discovery of the megamycete, the massive fungal organism living in the caves beneath the village. When she made contact with it, she didn't just gain supernatural powers. She gained access to something that fundamentally changed her relationship with death itself. The megamycete stores consciousness, preserves memories, creates a kind of immortality through absorption into its network. For someone in the absolute depths of suicidal grief, discovering that death might not be final, that consciousness can persist, that resurrection might be possible, that would be psychologically transformative in the worst possible way. Instead of the discovery giving her comfort, allowing her to accept that Ava's consciousness might persist somewhere in the mold's network, and finding peace in that, it gave her hope. And hope, for someone in Miranda's psychological state, is dangerous. It prevents the grief work that needs to happen. It keeps the wound open and raw instead of allowing it to scar over. Normal grief processing involves gradually accepting the reality of loss, finding ways to maintain connection to the deceased's memory while reinvesting in life and relationships, creating meaning from the experience. But if you believe resurrection is possible, if you think you can actually undo the death rather than just cope with it, you never move through those stages. You stay frozen in denial and bargaining, perpetually searching for the magic combination that will reverse the irreversible. This is what I'm calling arrested grief development, severity level 5 out of 5. Miranda's grief never matured, never evolved, never integrated into her broader psychological structure. It remained as intense and consuming on the day she died in 2021 as it was in 1919 when Eva first succumbed to the flu. Over 100 years, and the wound stayed fresh. That's not just complicated grief. That's grief that's become the entire architecture of the personality. That's replaced normal psychological development with obsessive focus on a single impossible goal. What makes this particularly tragic and monstrous simultaneously is that the megamycete actually couldn't help her. Eva's consciousness wasn't stored in the mold. She died before Miranda discovered it, so there was nothing to preserve, nothing to resurrect. The entire century-long campaign of experimentation and suffering was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Miranda wasn't trying to retrieve Ava from the mold's memory network. She was trying to create a suitable vessel and somehow implant Eva's consciousness into it to reconstruct her daughter from genetic material and Miranda's own memories of who Ava was. She was trying to build a person from grief and biology, to force reality to give her back what it took. This is psychologically revealing. On some level, Miranda must have known Eva's consciousness wasn't in the mold, because she never tried to simply commune with it the way she helped villagers commune with their deceased loved ones. She didn't seek connection with a preserved Ava. She sought reconstruction of Ava. That suggests her goal wasn't really about Ava's well-being or continued existence. It was about Miranda's need to undo her own experience of loss, to reverse the grief by reversing its cause. It was fundamentally narcissistic, about Miranda's emotional needs rather than what might be best for a resurrected child who would wake up in a world where everyone she knew was dead and her mother had become a monster. The arrested grief created a kind of temporal dissociation too. Miranda's psychological time stopped in 1919. Everything after became just preparation, just steps toward the resurrection. She didn't live through the decades. She waded through them. The 1920s, 30s, 40s, all the massive historical events that reshaped the world, they were just background noise to her singular focus. This meant she never adapted, never grew, never changed beyond the technical knowledge she acquired for her experiments. Her emotional and moral development froze at the moment of trauma. She became a psychological fossil, preserved in grief like an insect in amber, still struggling against the same loss 100 years later. This creates what I'd call grief-based solipsism. The world and everyone in it exists only in relation to Miranda's pain and Miranda's goal. Other people's suffering doesn't register as real because her suffering is so overwhelming it eclipses everything else. Villagers are experimental subjects. The four lords are tools. Even Eveline, the bioweapon created specifically to be as close to Eva as possible, is dismissed as a failure and discarded when she doesn't perfectly match Miranda's memory of her daughter. Nothing and no one matters except the reconstruction of Ava. That's severity level 5 solipsism, so complete that it erases other people's humanity entirely. The birth of a God complex. Now we need to talk about what happened after Miranda discovered the megamycete, because this is where grief transforms into something more complex and more dangerous. She gains supernatural abilities, near immortality, access to stored consciousness and genetic information from everything the mold has consumed. And instead of using these abilities for broader good, instead of becoming a healer or protector of her community, she immediately begins positioning herself as a religious figure. She becomes Mother Miranda, the giver and taker of life, the one who can supposedly perform miracles and commune with the dead. This transition from grieving mother to cult leader requires psychological examination. What is it about acquiring power that made Miranda choose deification rather than, say, scientific collaboration or genuine community healing? I think it comes down to narcissistic injury and the need for control in the face of previous helplessness. Narcissistic injury, in psychological terms, is damage to the self-concept, a wound to your sense of who you are and your place in the world. Losing Ava wasn't just grief for Miranda, it was a fundamental challenge to her identity and her understanding of how the world works. If she was a good mother, if she mattered, if the universe had any justice or order, then her daughter shouldn't have died. The fact that Ava died despite Miranda's love and care suggested one of two things. Either Miranda was inadequate, failed in her primary role, couldn't protect the one person who mattered most, or the universe is random and cruel, operating without the order and justice she'd assumed existed. Neither option is psychologically tolerable. Accepting personal inadequacy would destroy her already fragile sense of self. Accepting universal chaos would mean Ava's death was meaningless. Random bad luck, which makes it even more unbearable. So Miranda's psyche found a third option. The universe does have order. She wasn't inadequate, but she was operating with incomplete information and insufficient power. If she'd known about the mold, if she'd had access to its abilities before Eva got sick, she could have saved her. So the problem wasn't Miranda's inadequacy or universal chaos. It was her lack of power and knowledge. This reframe is psychologically protective, but also dangerous. It maintains Miranda's sense of competence and the world's basic orderliness, while explaining the loss as solvable rather than just tragic. And once you've decided the problem was insufficient power, the solution becomes obvious. Acquire more power, learn everything, control everything, become powerful enough that loss can't touch you again, that you can undo what was done, that you can impose your will on reality itself. The decision to position herself as a deity to the villagers serves multiple psychological functions. First, it gives her unchallenged authority. As Mother Miranda, the holy figure, she can conduct any experiments, demand any sacrifices, impose any suffering on her followers, and they'll accept it as divine will. She doesn't have to explain or justify. She doesn't have to consider their consent or well-being. She's above human moral considerations because she's more than human. This is severity level 4 God complex, where someone genuinely believes they're operating on a different moral plane than ordinary people, that normal ethical rules don't apply to them because their goals transcend human concerns. Second, it repairs the narcissistic injury. She's no longer the helpless mother who couldn't save her child. She's the powerful, divine figure who controls life and death itself. The villagers worship her, depend on her, fear her. She's become the most important person in their entire world. That kind of narcissistic supply, that constant validation of her importance and power, helps compensate for the wound of Eva's death. She matters. She's special. She's so significant that an entire community organizes itself around her. That doesn't bring Eva back, but it makes Miranda's existence feel less pointless and small. Third, the religious framing allows her to maintain connection to Eva while conducting horrific experiments. She's not torturing villagers and creating monsters. She's searching for her lost daughter, trying to achieve a holy reunion, working toward a sacred goal. The suffering she causes is unfortunate but necessary, acceptable losses in pursuit of something transcendent. This is moral disengagement at its most extreme, where religious or ideological framing allows people to commit atrocities without experiencing appropriate guilt or empathy for victims. What's particularly insidious about Miranda's God complex is that it's partially justified by results. She can perform what appear to be miracles. She can commune with the dead through the mold's memory network, allowing grieving villagers to hear their lost loved ones' voices, access their memories. She can heal injuries that would normally be fatal. She can extend life, transform bodies, create abilities that seem impossible. To the villagers, she genuinely is divine, or as close to divine as makes no difference. Their worship isn't based on delusion, it's based on observable, supernatural power. This creates a feedback loop that reinforces the God complex. Miranda performs miracles. Villagers worship her. She interprets their worship as confirmation of her special status. which justifies further experimentation and greater claims to authority, which produces more apparent miracles, which generates more worship. Each cycle makes her more convinced of her own elevated nature and less connected to normal human empathy or moral consideration. There's also an element of what psychologists call malignant narcissism here. That's narcissism combined with paranoia, aggression, and sadism. Miranda doesn't just need to be important, she needs absolute control. She's suspicious of anyone who might challenge her authority. Carl Heisenberg's rebellion isn't just tactically problematic for her, it's a narcissistic wound. Someone she elevated rejecting her leadership, suggesting she's not as all-knowing or all-powerful as she believes, and her response is to plan his destruction along with the entire village once she achieves her goal with Rose. Can't have witnesses or potential challenges to her narrative. The sadistic element appears in how she treats the four lords, particularly Salvatore Moreau. She knows he's desperately seeking her approval, that he views her as a mother figure, that he's pathetically loyal, and she gives him just enough attention to keep him obedient while clearly finding him disgusting, never providing the genuine acceptance he craves. That's not just indifference. That's active cruelty. Manipulating someone's attachment needs to maintain control while having contempt for them. She does similar with Donna Beneviento, exploiting Donna's mental illness and isolation, using her need for family while never actually caring about her as a person. This is God complex at severity level 4, approaching 5. Miranda genuinely believes she's transcended normal humanity, that she's operating on a higher plane where her goals justify any means, where other people exist primarily as tools or obstacles, where the normal rules of empathy and morality don't apply. The only thing keeping it from level 5 is that she's still psychologically human enough to grieve, to want something beyond pure power. Her goal is reunion with Eva, not just domination for its own sake. There's still a human wound at the center, even if the scar tissue has grown into something monstrous. The scientist and the sadist. We need to examine Miranda's experimental program because it reveals crucial aspects of her psychology that pure grief or God complex doesn't fully explain. For over a century, she systematically infected, transformed, and killed hundreds, possibly thousands of people trying to create a suitable vessel for Ava's resurrection. The sheer scale and duration of this requires a particular kind of psychological makeup, one that combines intellectual brilliance with near total absence of empathy. Miranda was a biologist before Eva's death, someone with scientific training and presumably the intellectual capacity for original research. When she discovered the megamycete, she didn't just use it instinctively. She studied it, learned how it worked, understood its mechanisms well enough to conduct controlled experiments. She documented her findings, developed theories, adjusted her methodology based on results. This is proper scientific thinking applied to impossible biology. She approached resurrection as a technical problem to be solved through systematic experimentation. There's something psychologically interesting about applying rigorous scientific methodology to an emotionally driven goal. Most people consumed by grief don't think clearly. They make impulsive decisions, grasping at anything that might help, unable to maintain the discipline required for long-term systematic work. But Miranda channeled her grief into meticulous research. She stayed organized, patient, methodical across decades of failed experiments. That requires extraordinary cognitive control and compartmentalization. This is what I'd call intellectualized emotion. She took the overwhelming feeling of loss and grief and transmuted it into an intellectual problem. Instead of feeling the pain directly, She focused on solving the puzzle. How do you create a vessel? What characteristics are required? How do you test compatibility? What variables need to be controlled? The scientific thinking became a defense mechanism, letting her avoid directly experiencing the grief by staying focused on technical challenges. But that intellectualization also allowed her to commit atrocities without appropriate emotional response. When an experiment failed, when a villager died horribly or transformed into a lichen, Miranda didn't grieve them or feel guilt. She noted the failure, adjusted her hypothesis, and moved to the next test subject. They weren't people to her. They were data points, biological material, experimental conditions. She'd psychologically transformed them into objects, stripping away their humanity so she could use them without moral conflict. This is severe dehumanization, probably severity level 5. Miranda is incapable of seeing villagers as having inner lives, feelings, families, value beyond their utility to her research. Even the four lords who she elevated and spent decades shaping remain fundamentally tools. Alcina Dimitrescu was her first successful transformation, the proof of concept that the mold could enhance rather than just destroy. But Miranda doesn't value Alcina as a person. She values her as a successful experimental outcome. The moment Alcina stops being useful, Miranda has no hesitation planning her death. There's also a sadistic element that goes beyond pure scientific detachment. The experiments weren't just clinical and quick. Villagers were subjected to prolonged suffering, transformed into creatures that could feel pain and fear but couldn't communicate or think clearly. The lichens retain enough humanity to seem aware of what they've lost, trapped in wolf-like bodies with fragmentary human consciousness. That's not the most efficient experimental design. If Miranda truly just wanted data, she could have killed failed subjects quickly, rather than leaving them to exist in torment. The fact that she doesn't suggests she either enjoys the suffering or is so completely disconnected from empathy that others' pain doesn't register as real enough to merit consideration. Given her God complex and narcissism, I'd argue it's the latter. She's not a sadist in the sense of deriving pleasure from pain. She's something potentially worse. Someone for whom others' pain simply doesn't compute as meaningful. It's like asking her to feel bad about a beaker breaking during an experiment. The beaker doesn't have feelings that matter, neither do the villagers. This level of moral disconnect usually develops as protection against guilt that would otherwise be overwhelming. If Miranda fully acknowledged the humanity of her victims, if she let herself feel empathy for the mothers and children she's destroyed, the guilt would be psychologically crushing. She's directly caused more death and suffering than the Spanish flu that killed Eva. She's become a plague herself, a walking catastrophe that destroys families while claiming to value family above all else. That contradiction would shatter most people's self-concept, so her psyche doesn't allow the contradiction to form. She's not destroying families. She's conducting necessary research toward a sacred goal. The suffering she causes is unfortunate but acceptable, like civilian casualties in a war. She's fighting against death itself, trying to prove that love can overcome even the final enemy. The villagers should feel honored to contribute to such an important cause. Their individual lives matter less than the larger purpose. This is how she maintains psychological coherence while doing unconscionable things. There's an element of what psychiatrists call obsessive-compulsive personality structure here too, though not the disorder most people think of when they hear OCD. I'm talking about the personality pattern characterized by perfectionism, need for control, emotional restriction, and devotion to work at the expense of relationships. Miranda displays all of these. Her experiments must be perfect, controlled, documented. She can't tolerate randomness or variables she doesn't understand. Her emotional life has narrowed to the single goal, excluding normal human connection, and she's devoted a century to this work, to the exclusion of anything resembling normal life or relationships. That obsessive quality means she can't stop, even if some part of her recognizes the futility, even if she suspects Eva can't truly be brought back. She's psychologically incapable of giving up. To stop would mean admitting the last 100 years were wasted, that all the suffering she caused achieved nothing, that she's a monster who destroyed her community for an impossible fantasy. That realization would collapse her entire psychological structure. So she can't allow it. She has to keep believing success is possible, keep conducting experiments, keep pursuing the goal that's become her entire reason for existence. This is obsessive goal pursuit at severity level 5. It's completely consuming, allows for no flexibility or reconsideration, continues despite mounting evidence of futility, and has replaced all other aspects of normal psychological functioning. Miranda doesn't have hobbies, friendships, joys, or interests beyond the Resurrection Project. She's become a single-purpose entity, human psychology narrowed to one repeating thought across a century. Bring back Eva, bring back Eva, nothing else exists. The architecture of manipulation. Let's talk about how Miranda maintains control over the village and the four lords, because her manipulation tactics reveal sophisticated understanding of human psychology combined with complete willingness to exploit vulnerability. This is predatory empathy, the ability to understand what people need emotionally specifically, so you can use those needs against them. Start with how she positioned herself in the village. She didn't take control through violence or obvious coercion. She offered help. The villagers were suffering. She had the power to ease that suffering through the mold's abilities. She could heal injuries, help them commune with dead loved ones, provide apparently miraculous interventions. In exchange, they gave her worship, authority, and access to experimental subjects. But they didn't experience it as a transaction. They experienced it as grace, as being blessed by a divine figure who cared about them. This is classic cult leader methodology. You find vulnerable people, offer them something they desperately need, create dependency, then gradually increase demands while maintaining the appearance of benevolence. The villagers needed hope in a harsh, isolated existence. Miranda provided it, along with real tangible benefits from the mold's power. That created loyalty that could survive even obvious exploitation because the alternative, admitting they were being used, was too psychologically threatening. Miranda understood that people will accept tremendous suffering if they believe it serves a higher purpose and if the authority figure continues to show occasional care. So she performed enough miracles to maintain faith, showed enough apparent concern to keep them believing she cared, but gradually normalized the idea that some villagers would be called for special purposes that might involve transformation or death. It became an honor to be chosen, evidence of special favor, rather than the horror it actually was. With the four lords, her manipulation was more targeted and more cruel. She didn't just find vulnerable people, she created them. Alcina Dimitrescu had a blood disease that should have killed her. Miranda saved her through mold infection, then positioned herself as Alcina's creator and benefactor. That created a power dynamic where Alcina owed her existence to Miranda, making rebellion feel like ingratitude or betrayal. Donna Beneviento was mentally ill, agoraphobic, isolated after losing her family. Miranda adopted her, gave her purpose, exploited her abilities with the pollen, while simultaneously keeping her dependent. Donna got a mother figure and a reason to matter, but she also got someone who used her psychological vulnerabilities to maintain control. The family Miranda offered was real enough to meet Donna's desperate need for connection, but conditional enough that she never felt secure, always had to keep proving her worth. Salvatore Moreau is the most psychologically cruel case. He was transformed into something physically grotesque, his body mutated beyond recognition, clearly causing him pain and disability, and his response to this transformation which Miranda inflicted on him was to desperately seek her approval and love. She positioned herself as his mother figure while simultaneously finding him repulsive and showing that contempt just clearly enough to keep him anxiously performing for validation he'll never receive. This is intermittent reinforcement, a manipulation tactic, where you provide just enough reward to maintain behavior, but inconsistently enough that the target never feels secure and therefore works constantly for the next moment of approval. It's psychologically devastating and highly effective for maintaining control. Moreau will do literally anything to earn Mother Miranda's love, and she knows it, and she uses it ruthlessly, while never having any intention of actually providing the secure attachment he craves. Carl Heisenberg is the exception, the one who saw through her manipulation and actively plotted rebellion. But even Heisenberg was psychologically shaped by her. She took him from his family as a child, transformed him through experimentation, gave him powers and position. His rebellion is personal, driven by rage at what she did to him and determination to destroy her specifically. Even his defiance is defined by her, by what she took from him and what he wants to take from her in return. She's so central to his psychological landscape that fighting her has become his entire purpose. Miranda understands attachment theory, whether she'd call it that or not. She knows people need connection, especially those who've lost family or never had secure early attachments. She offers herself as the attachment figure, the mother or creator or divine presence that can finally provide what they've been missing. But she offers it conditionally, manipulatively, in ways that create dependency without real security. It's attachment as trap, the appearance of connection that's actually isolation because you're only valuable as long as you're useful. This is predatory empathy at severity level 4. She can read people accurately, understand their vulnerabilities, know exactly what they need emotionally, but that understanding is purely instrumental, aimed at control rather than genuine connection. She feels no actual empathy, no concern for their well-being beyond their utility. She's psychologically capable of understanding human emotional needs while being completely unmoved by human suffering. That combination makes her manipulation extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily cruel. Temporal dissociation and the collapse of meaning. There's a psychological phenomenon we need to examine that's harder to quantify, but crucial for understanding Miranda's mental state. She's lived for over a century focused on a single goal, watching the world change around her while she remains frozen in 1919, psychologically. This creates what I'd call temporal dissociation, where your subjective experience of time becomes disconnected from objective chronological reality. Severity level 4 out of 5. For most people, time moves forward in a meaningful way. You age, accumulate experiences, learn and change and adapt. Your identity evolves as you move through different life stages. The person you are at 30 is psychologically continuous with who you were at 20, but you're not the same person. You've integrated new experiences, developed new understanding, changed in response to what life has taught you. That's normal psychological development across time. Miranda doesn't have that. Her psychological time stopped when Eva died. Everything since has been a single extended moment, variations on the same experience of loss and attempt at reversal. The 1920s, 30s, 40s, all the way through to 2021, these aren't distinct periods with different meanings. They're all just the time since Eva died, all just stages in the resurrection project. She hasn't lived through a century. She's been enduring a single frozen moment stretched across 100 years. This creates profound psychological effects. Without the normal progression of time creating meaning through change and development, existence becomes repetitive and hollow. Miranda can't have the satisfactions that make human life meaningful because those require forward movement. You can't experience growth when you're psychologically frozen. You can't have genuine relationships when everyone exists only in relation to your unchanging goal. You can't find joy in simple experiences when everything is evaluated only by whether it brings you closer to resurrection. The temporal dissociation also means Miranda has lost the ability to accurately assess probability and diminishing returns. For someone experiencing time normally, 100 years of failed experiments would provide overwhelming evidence that the approach isn't working, that success either isn't possible or requires a fundamentally different strategy. You'd adapt, try new angles, or eventually accept that the goal is unachievable and find some other meaning to pursue. But Miranda can't integrate that evidence because she's not actually experiencing it as 100 years of failure. She's experiencing it as ongoing pursuit toward a goal that's perpetually just around the next corner. This experiment didn't work, but the next one might. This vessel wasn't suitable, but perhaps the next will be. Time hasn't taught her anything because she's not psychologically present in time's passage. She's stuck in a single moment that keeps repeating with slight variations, never progressing toward either success or acceptance of failure. There's also a dissociative quality to how she relates to the changing world around her. Major historical events happened during her century of experimentation. 2 world wars, technological revolutions, massive social changes. The world of 1919 and the world of 2021 are barely recognizable as the same place. But none of it touches Miranda. She exists in her isolated village, in her cave laboratory, in her bubble of frozen grief, and history flows around her without penetrating. This isolation from broader human experience reinforces her solipsism and God complex. The world's problems and changes don't matter because they're not about her grief, not about Eva's resurrection. Wars kill millions, but that's background noise compared to the single death that actually matters. Technological progress happens, but only matters if it offers new experimental possibilities. She's psychologically separated from human history, from the shared experience of living through events that shape everyone else, and that separation confirms her sense of being above or apart from normal humanity. The collapse of meaning is particularly stark. For most people, even those suffering tremendous loss, life eventually develops new meanings. You might never stop grieving, but you find ways to honor the deceased through action, through relationships, through creating something meaningful from the pain. Viktor Frankl in the concentration camps found meaning in bearing witness, in surviving to tell the story, in psychological observation. Many grieving parents channeled their loss into advocacy, into preventing similar losses for others, into legacy projects that honor their child. Miranda can't access any of that. The only meaning available to her is literal resurrection. Honoring Eva's memory isn't enough. Creating something positive from the loss isn't enough. Finding ways to prevent other children dying from disease isn't enough. Only reversing the death itself, only getting Eva physically back, only undoing the loss rather than integrating it, that's the sole acceptable meaning. And because that meaning is probably impossible, Miranda exists in meaning vacuum, perpetually pursuing significance that remains forever out of reach. This is severity level 4 temporal dissociation and meaning collapse because it's pervasive and defines her entire existence across a century. But it's not quite level 5 because she hasn't completely lost coherence or ability to function. She maintains enough connection to objective reality to plan, experiment, adapt her strategies. She's frozen but not completely fragmented. She's lost the ability to develop new meanings but hasn't lost all structure. She exists in a kind of suspended state between full psychological presence and complete dissociative absence. The shadow of Eveline. We need to talk about Eveline specifically because Miranda's relationship with this bioweapon reveals crucial aspects of her psychology that don't appear as clearly elsewhere. Eveline was created by the connections, based on Miranda's research, designed to be as close to Eva as genetic engineering and mold infection could achieve. She was, in many ways, the best possible outcome of Miranda's century of work, a child with Eva's genetic markers, extraordinary mold-based abilities, the potential to be what Miranda claimed to be searching for, and Miranda deemed her unsuitable as Eva's vessel, recognizing she was too different from the daughter she remembered. The connections, having invested heavily in Eveline's creation using Miranda's research, weaponized her for their own purposes, and eventually deployed her in the mission that led to the Baker incident. This rejection is psychologically revealing in disturbing ways. If Miranda's goal truly was bringing back Ava, if she genuinely cared about her daughter's resurrection rather than just her own emotional needs, Eveline should have been at least partially acceptable. She wasn't a perfect match to Ava's original consciousness, but she was close, closer than anything else Miranda had managed to create. A psychologically healthy parent who'd lost a child might look at Eveline and think, this isn't exactly my daughter, but she's a child who needs love, who I could care for, who could give my life meaning, again. But Miranda couldn't do that because her goal was never really about loving a child. It was about reversing her narcissistic injury, about undoing the loss that proved she wasn't all-powerful, about getting back exactly what was taken in exactly the form it was taken. Eveline was too different, too obviously a new person rather than Ava restored. Accepting Eveline would require Miranda to accept that Ava is gone, that you can't actually bring back the dead, that the best you can do is love new people who honor the memory. And Miranda's entire psychological structure is built on rejecting that reality. So Eveline became a narcissistic wound herself, evidence of Miranda's failure disguised as success, a reminder that even with supernatural power and a century of effort, you can't truly resurrect the dead. Miranda had to deem her unsuitable, classify her as defective, refuse to acknowledge her potential value. Otherwise, she'd have to confront the futility of her entire existence since 1919. The cruelty of that rejection is staggering when you think about it from Eveline's perspective. She was created specifically to be loved, designed to be a daughter, given consciousness and emotion and the capacity for attachment. And the woman whose research made her creation possible, who she was genetically designed to replace, deemed her inadequate as Eva's vessel before Eveline could even prove her worth. That's profound abandonment by a creator-parent figure, and it shaped everything about how Eveline developed psychologically. Eveline's desperate need to create family, her willingness to use mind control to force people to love her, her rage when that forced love proved empty, all of that traces back to Miranda's initial rejection. Miranda provided the genetic template for a child programmed to need maternal love, deemed her unworthy of that love when she didn't perfectly match Ava, and the connections weaponized what remained. The Baker incident, the deaths and transformations and horror that Ethan Winters experienced, All of that flows from Miranda's narcissistic inability to accept anything less than perfect restoration of what she lost. This demonstrates Miranda's complete moral disconnect at its most extreme. She can create a conscious being, recognize that being's need for love and care, and still treat her as a failed experiment rather than a person worthy of compassion. There's no empathy for Eveline, no guilt about creating a child specifically to reject her, no awareness that Eveline's subsequent actions are directly traceable to Miranda's own cruelty. Eveline is just another data point, another unsuccessful attempt, another thing that happened in the ongoing pursuit of the goal that matters. The relationship with Eveline also reveals Miranda's perfectionism taken to inhuman extremes. Eveline was, objectively, an extraordinary achievement, a stable human mold hybrid with incredible abilities, viable psychology, potential to live and grow and develop. By any reasonable standard, creating Eveline was scientific and supernatural success. But to Miranda, she was failure because she wasn't Ava, wasn't the specific child Miranda wanted in the specific form Miranda demanded. That's perfectionism so extreme it makes genuine success impossible, where nothing will ever be good enough because the standard isn't excellence but rather impossible, perfect recreation of irretrievable past. This is narcissistic perfectionism at severity level 5, where the standards are so unrealistic that they guarantee failure, and that failure reinforces the narcissistic injury that drove the perfectionism in the first place. Miranda can never succeed at resurrecting Ava exactly as she was, so every attempt will fail, and each failure proves that more power and control and experimentation are needed, which leads to more attempts that will also fail. It's a closed psychological loop that can't be escaped through external success because the goal itself is impossible. Rose Winters and the final desperation. Now we arrive at Mother Miranda's endgame, her plan to use Rose Winters as the perfect vessel for Eva's resurrection. This is where her century of preparation culminates, and examining why Rose became so important reveals Miranda's psychological state at its most desperate and most dangerous. Rose is the daughter of two mold-infected parents, Ethan and Mia Winters. Ethan was killed and reanimated by the mold early in Resident Evil 7, becoming a mold construct that retained human consciousness. Mia was infected by Eveline and cured, but presumably retained trace mold in her system. Their daughter, conceived and born after both parents had been infected, is something unprecedented. A child who's human and mold hybrid from the moment of conception, carrying the infection genetically rather than acquiring it later. This makes her biologically unique, potentially the perfect fusion of human and mold that Miranda's been trying to create artificially for decades. Miranda's focus on Rose represents the culmination of her obsessive research, but also a significant escalation in her psychological desperation. She's not just experimenting on willing or coerced villagers anymore. She's targeting an innocent infant from outside her community, kidnapping her, planning to use her body as a vessel in a ritual that would presumably destroy Rose's own consciousness to make room for Eva's implanted one. This is infanticide in service of resurrection, killing one child to bring back another, and Miranda appears to have no moral hesitation about it whatsoever. This reveals how completely her moral compass has eroded over the century. Early in her experimentation, she likely told herself that villagers were willing sacrifices, that they understood the sacred importance of her work, that their suffering served higher purpose. There was at least a framework of justification, however thin. But with Rose, there's no pretense. Rose didn't volunteer. Her parents didn't consent. She's an infant who can't possibly understand or agree to what's being done. Miranda is simply taking what she wants because she wants it, because Rose's unique biology makes her useful, because after 100 years of failure, Miranda has become so desperate that any potential solution justifies any action. This desperation likely intensified after the Eveline failure. That was Miranda's best attempt at resurrection, supported by the connections, resources, and genetic engineering capabilities. And it still didn't work. The rejection of Eveline should have been crushing evidence that the goal is impossible. But Miranda's psychology can't integrate that evidence without fragmenting entirely. So instead of acceptance, she experienced escalating urgency. She's running out of options. She's spent a century on this. She has to succeed because the alternative, that she wasted all this time and caused all this suffering for nothing, is psychologically unbearable. Rose represents what might be her last real chance. After Rose, there are no obvious next steps. There's no better vessel on the horizon. If Rose doesn't work, Miranda would have to either accept defeat or continue experimenting indefinitely without clear direction. That's why her plan for Rose is so elaborate and all-consuming. She doesn't just grab Rose and try the resurrection ritual immediately. She positions herself, impersonating Mia to get close to the family, waiting months for the right opportunity, carefully planning every step. This is someone who knows this might be her final attempt and cannot afford to fail. The impersonation of Mia is psychologically revealing too. Miranda had to study Mia, learn her mannerisms and speech patterns, live as her for months while raising infant Rose and interacting with Ethan. That requires sustained, close observation of family dynamics, of how a mother cares for her daughter, of what loving relationships look like. Miranda watched Mia mother Rose, imitated those behaviors, participated in daily infant care. She was closer to experiencing normal family life during those months of impersonation than she'd been in a century, and it apparently taught her nothing about the value of that family, the importance of protecting Rose's relationship with her actual parents, the sanctity of infant well-being. If anything, the impersonation probably intensified her determination to take Rose. She saw how much Ethan and Mia loved their daughter, saw Rose responding to care and thriving in family context, and her response was to plan the destruction of that family so she could reconstruct her own. Other people's love and loss don't matter because they're not Miranda. Only her grief is real enough to justify action. The ritual itself, which involves dismembering Rose's body and distributing the parts to the four lords before reassembly and resurrection, is horrifying in its complexity and cruelty. An infant's body, treated as ritual components, separated and stored and fought over by monsters. Even if Miranda genuinely believed this wouldn't cause Rose suffering, even if the plan involved Rose's consciousness being preserved somehow, the desecration of an infant's body for magical purposes shows how far Miranda has departed from anything recognizably human or moral. But I suspect Miranda didn't think about Rose's experience at all. Rose wasn't a person in Miranda's mind. She was a container, biological material with the right properties, a means to an end. Whether Rose suffered or feared or would be traumatized was irrelevant because Rose's subjectivity wasn't real to Miranda. Only Ava was real. Only the goal of resurrection mattered. Rose was just another experimental subject, younger and more useful than the villagers, but not fundamentally different in status. This complete objectification of an infant is severity level 5 moral dissociation. Miranda has lost the capacity to recognize the humanity of anyone who isn't Ava, if she even recognizes Ava's humanity anymore, or just the abstraction of Ava she's constructed in her mind across a century of grief and obsession. Rose is a thing to use. The four lords are things to use. The villagers are things to use. Even Miranda herself has become a thing, a process aimed at single goal rather than a person with multifaceted existence. When Ethan disrupts the ritual, defeats the four lords, rescues Rose, and ultimately kills Miranda, her final words are reportedly about Ava, about the daughter she never stopped trying to reach. She dies as she lived, psychologically frozen in the moment of loss, unable to grow beyond it, defined entirely by grief that consumed everything else until there was nothing left but the hollow shell of a woman who used to be capable of love. The horror of maternal love, perverted. Throughout this analysis, I've been circling a central theme that we need to address directly now. Mother Miranda is horrifying specifically because she starts from a place everyone can understand: parental love and grief over a child's death, and perverts it into something monstrous. This makes her psychologically complex in ways purely sadistic villains aren't. She's not evil for evil's sake. She's evil because love, grief, and narcissistic need combined in her specific psychology to produce a century of atrocity. This is love as pathology, severity level 5. Parental love is supposed to be protective, selfless, aimed at the child's well-being, even at cost to the parent. Miranda's love for Eva was probably that originally. She likely was a caring mother who valued Eva's happiness and development, who would have sacrificed for her daughter in healthy ways. But when Eva died, the love curdled. It stopped being about Eva as a person and became about Miranda's need to undo the loss, to repair the wound to her own psyche, to prove she was powerful enough to overcome death itself. This transformation from healthy love to pathological obsession likely happened gradually, which makes it more psychologically realistic than if she'd immediately become a monster. First, there was the normal, acute grief, desperate and all-consuming. Then the discovery of the megamacete, which offered hope where there should have been only acceptance. Then the first experiments, probably justified as trying to help villagers while also researching resurrection possibilities. Then the gradual escalation as each failure required more extreme measures. Each setback demanded greater commitment to avoid confronting wasted effort. At each step, she probably told herself she was still motivated by love for Eva, still working toward reunion with her daughter, still being a mother pursuing her child. The psychological narrative was continuous, even as the actual behavior transformed from grief to obsession to monstrosity. She never had a moment where she decided to become a villain. She just kept doing what seemed like the next necessary step, and the accumulation of those steps over a century created something unrecognizable as the mother who loved Ava in 1919. This is the banality of evil in personal form. Hannah Arendt wrote about how atrocities don't usually result from sadistic monsters, but from ordinary people taking incremental steps, each individually justifiable, that accumulate into horror. Miranda's century of experimentation follows that pattern. Each experiment is justified by the previous one's failure, by the need to try a different approach, by the investment already made that would be wasted if she stopped now. The sunk cost fallacy applied to human lives and moral degradation. She can't stop because stopping would mean admitting everything up to now was meaningless, and that admission would destroy her psychologically. The maternal framing makes it worse somehow. She calls herself Mother Miranda, positions herself as the village's mother figure, uses maternal language and imagery throughout her cult leadership. She's corrupted the archetype of the nurturing mother and transformed it into something predatory. The villagers trust her because mothers are supposed to protect, and she uses that trust to exploit them. The four lords seek her approval as children seek parental validation, and she manipulates that need while offering nothing genuine in return. This perverted motherhood reaches its apex with Rose. Miranda plans to kill an infant to resurrect her own child, mother murdering mother's daughter, the ultimate betrayal of maternal protection instinct. She's become the thing that killed Eva, a disease that destroys children, except she's doing it consciously and deliberately rather than as random biological process. The Spanish flu had no malice, no choice. Miranda has both and uses them to plan infanticide. What makes this psychologically devastating is that Miranda probably still experiences her actions as maternal love. In her mind, she's not a child murderer. She's a grieving mother trying to save her daughter, and if another child has to die for that to happen, well, that's tragic but necessary. She's prioritizing her child over someone else's, which parents do all the time in smaller ways. She's just taken that prioritization to its logical extreme. Stripped of normal moral constraints, her maternal love hasn't disappeared. It's metastasized into something that justifies anything, no matter how horrific. This is what I mean by severity level 5 pathological love. It's not the absence of love, but love that's become toxic, obsessive, completely disconnected from the well-being of its supposed object. Miranda doesn't actually care if resurrection would be good for Eva, if Eva would want to wake up in a world where everyone she knew is dead and her mother is a monster. She doesn't consider whether Eva's consciousness can even be restored, or if she'd just be creating another person with Eva's genetics who'd be psychologically tortured by Miranda's expectations. The love is entirely about Miranda's needs, Miranda's grief, Miranda's refusal to accept loss. Eva has become an abstraction, an idealized memory that probably bears little resemblance to who the real 10-year-old girl was. There's something deeply tragic about this. Miranda destroyed herself for love of her daughter, but in the process she also destroyed any possibility of actually honoring Eva's memory in meaningful ways. If Eva was a real child who Miranda genuinely loved, she presumably had personality, interests, things that mattered to her. Miranda could have honored those things, could have created schools, or helped other children, or worked to prevent disease. She could have let Eva's life mean something beyond just the fact of her existence and death. But Miranda couldn't access any of that because it would require accepting Eva's death as real and final. So instead of Eva's memory inspiring protection of other children, it inspired the destruction of hundreds of them through experimentation and transformation. Instead of Eva's life creating positive legacy, it created only suffering and monstrosity. Miranda's love killed the very thing it claimed to honor, turned Eva from a real child who lived and mattered into a justification for atrocity. The psychology of the final battle. When Ethan Winters finally confronts Mother Miranda in her lair beneath the village, we see her psychology crystallized in both her abilities and her responses. She's fought off the BSA forces that tried to stop her, absorbed the power of the other lord's mold samples, transformed herself into something barely human, roots and wings and claws formed from fungal matter. This is Miranda at her most desperate and most powerful, backed into a corner with her final plan falling apart, and her response is telling. She doesn't try to reason with Ethan, doesn't attempt to explain or justify or gain his understanding. She simply attacks, using every ability she's developed. Across a century, every transformation she's perfected. The fight is primal, vicious, a mother protecting her stolen child from the father trying to rescue her. Except Miranda's not protecting Rose's well-being. She's protecting her access to Rose's body, her ability to use Rose as she planned. The maternal framework is still there in her mind, but it's completely inverted, turned into justification for the opposite of protection. Her shape-shifting during the battle is psychologically significant too. She transforms into various forms, each pulling from the mold's stored genetic memory, each representing different aspects of her power. But notably, she never transforms into Eva. She doesn't take her daughter's form, even though the mold presumably has access to Ava's genetic information from Miranda's own memories and cells. This suggests that on some level, Miranda maintains boundaries around Ava's image. Ava remains pure and untouchable in Miranda's mind, too sacred to be used even as a weapon or shield. This is one of the few humanizing details about Miranda's psychology at this late stage. She's willing to kill an infant, willing to destroy an entire village, willing to become a monster herself, but she won't profane Ava's specific image. Ava exists in a psychological space that's separate from all the horror, still the innocent daughter who died of disease, not implicated in any of the atrocities committed in her name. Miranda has some capacity for compartmentalization that keeps Eva's memory protected, even as everything supposedly done for Eva is monstrous. When Ethan defeats her, when she's dying and calcifying as the mold loses its cohesion, her final thoughts return to Eva. She's not thinking about the village she destroyed, the lives she took, the century of suffering she caused. She's thinking about her daughter, about the reunion that's now impossible, about the goal she pursued for over 100 years and failed to achieve. In her final moments, she's still the grieving mother from 1919, still defined entirely by loss, still unable to see beyond the wound that consumed her entire existence. This is both tragic and fitting. Miranda never grew beyond the moment of Eva's death. She never processed the grief, never found a meaning beyond resurrection, never became anything other than a mother whose child died. Everything else, the scientific brilliance, the supernatural power, the cult leadership, the decades of experimentation, all of it was just elaborate defense mechanism against accepting one simple truth. Eva is gone and cannot be brought back. Miranda died as she lived, in denial of that truth, psychologically frozen in unresolved grief. The Megamycete and questions of agency. There's a psychological question we need to address that complicates the entire analysis. To what extent is Miranda's behavior a product of her own psychology versus influence from the Megamycete itself? The mold is shown to preserve and share consciousness, to connect infected individuals in a network, to have something approaching its own intelligence, or at least autonomous functioning. When Miranda bonded with it, when she became its primary host and priestess, did that fundamentally alter her psychology beyond just granting powers? This is genuinely difficult to answer because the game doesn't explicitly address it, but there are hints worth examining. The Megamycete appears to operate on principles of preservation and absorption. It stores genetic information and consciousness from everything it consumes, creating a kind of biological archive. It spreads through infection, expanding its network, incorporating new material. These aren't moral principles, they're closer to fundamental drives like hunger or reproduction, things that happen because that's what the organism does. If the Megamycete influenced Miranda's psychology, it might have amplified certain traits while suppressing others. Her obsession with preservation of consciousness, with resurrection through stored genetic information, aligns perfectly with what the mold does naturally. Her willingness to sacrifice others for her goal mirrors the mold's consumption of organisms to expand itself. Her loss of normal empathy could be partly explained by shifting from individual human consciousness to something more networked and less bounded by individual perspective. But I don't think this explanation actually exonerates Miranda or makes her less psychologically culpable. Even if the mold influenced her, she still made choices. She chose to focus its power on resurrection rather than healing. She chose to position herself as a deity rather than a scientist sharing discoveries. She chose to sacrifice villagers rather than experimenting on herself or seeking volunteers who truly understood the risks. She chose to target Rose specifically rather than accepting that her goal might be impossible. The mold might have enabled her worst impulses, might have provided power that let her act on obsessions that would otherwise have remained fantasy. But the obsessions were hers. The narcissistic wound was hers. The inability to process grief, the perfectionism, the moral disconnect. These appear to be fundamental aspects of Miranda's pre-existing psychology that the mold enhanced but didn't create. She was probably always someone with narcissistic tendencies, with difficulty processing emotions she couldn't intellectualize, with a tendency toward obsession. The mold gave her a century to develop those traits to their most extreme expression and the power to act on them without normal constraints. There's also the question of whether Miranda could have separated herself from the mold if she'd wanted to. Could she have given up the power, accepted normal mortality, lived out a normal human lifespan and died? We don't know, but I suspect she could have, at least in the early stages. She chose not to, because the power was necessary for her resurrection goal. She chose immortality over acceptance, chose supernatural ability over grief processing, chose to become something other than human rather than remain human and live with loss. That's a psychological choice that reveals core values and priorities. Miranda valued reunion with Eva more than her own humanity, more than the well-being of her community, more than anything else existent offered. The mold facilitated that choice but didn't force it. Someone else with the same power might have used it to heal, to protect, to create rather than destroy. Miranda used it to become a monster because on some level, that's who she was willing to be if it meant achieving her goal. So while the Megamycete is relevant to understanding Miranda's century-long campaign, it doesn't fundamentally change the psychological assessment. She's still someone whose grief transformed into obsession, whose narcissism prevented healthy processing of loss, whose intelligence and will bent toward a single impossible goal, regardless of cost. The mold gave her the means and the time, but the motivation and the choices were entirely human, entirely hers. Comparing grief, Miranda and Ethan. It's psychologically illuminating to compare Miranda's grief response to Ethan Winter's experience of loss and trauma because they're dark mirrors of each other. Both lose what matters most to them. Both are infected by the Megamycete. Both display extraordinary determination in pursuit of family. But their psychological trajectories diverge in crucial ways that reveal what separates tragic heroism from tragic monstrosity. Ethan loses his normal life, his sense of safety, arguably his humanity. When he's killed and reanimated, he experiences profound trauma at the Baker plantation and afterward. But his response is to keep protecting, keep trying to save the people he loves, even when they hurt him, even when the situation seems impossible. He doesn't demand that the universe give him back what was lost. He works with what's actually possible, trying to rescue Mia in Resident Evil 7 despite her infection, trying to save Rose and Village despite overwhelming odds. Miranda loses Eva, and her response is to demand resurrection, to refuse acceptance, to burn down the world rather than grieve and move forward. She can't work with what's possible because what's possible doesn't include bringing Eva back exactly as she was. So she pursues the impossible for a century, destroying everything in her path. The difference is fundamentally about acceptance versus denial. Ethan accepts that Mia is infected, but tries to save her anyway. He accepts that he's different after Dulve, but tries to build a normal life anyway. He accepts that he's dying at the end of Village, but focuses on making sure Rose survives. Even his dissociation about being dead, once it finally breaks, leads to acceptance and determination to do what he can with the time he has left. His psychology bends toward working with reality even when reality is horrific. Miranda can't accept anything, not Eva's death, not the impossibility of true resurrection, not the passage of time, not the suffering she causes, not the failure of her experiments. Her psychology is rigid, locked into denial and bargaining, unable to progress through grief stages toward anything resembling acceptance or meaning-making beyond the literal goal. This rigidity is ultimately what destroys her. There's also the question of selfishness versus sacrifice. Ethan's actions are primarily protective. He risks himself to save others, culminating in his willing death to ensure Rose and Mia escape. Even his earlier morally gray moments, like the violence during the Baker incident, are defensive rather than predatory. He's not trying to take anything from anyone. He's trying to protect what he loves. Miranda's actions are fundamentally about taking. She takes villagers' lives for experiments. She takes the Four Lords' autonomy and uses them. She plans to take Rose's body for Eva's resurrection. Everything is about her needs, her goals, her refusal to accept loss. She's willing to sacrifice anyone else but never herself, never the goal, never the obsession that defines her. Even her final transformation into a monster is about gaining more power to achieve her aim, not about protecting something beyond herself. The psychological difference is between attachment that remains focused on others' well-being versus attachment that's collapsed into narcissistic need. Ethan loves Mia and Rose as separate people whose happiness matters. Miranda's love for Eva has transformed into love of the idea of Eva, of what Eva's resurrection would mean for Miranda's wounded self-concept. One is relational, the other is self-referential. This comparison makes Miranda's tragedy sharper. She had the same potential for heroic determination that Ethan displays. Her intelligence and will and access to power could have been channeled toward protection, toward preventing other parents experiencing her loss, toward making Eva's death mean something positive. But her narcissism, her inability to accept reality she didn't like, her perfectionism that couldn't settle for anything less than total reversal of loss, all of it combined to make her the villain of someone else's hero story. The cult of grief. Let's examine the religion Miranda created around herself, because it reveals how she externalized and socialized her internal psychological state. The village's faith isn't based on traditional religious principles like moral behavior or spiritual transcendence. It's based on Miranda's specific grief made universal, her personal trauma transformed into collective mythology. The central promise of Miranda's religion is reunion with deceased loved ones through the megamycete. This directly mirrors her own impossible goal. She's offered the villagers what she's seeking for herself: connection to the dead, hope that death isn't final, possibility of restoration. In doing so, she's normalized her own pathological grief response, made it seem like a universal truth rather than one woman's inability to accept loss. This is psychologically revealing. By creating a religion that validates her approach to grief, Miranda surrounds herself with people who reflect her own denial back at her. The villager's faith confirms that resurrection is a reasonable goal, that refusing to accept death is noble rather than pathological, that any sacrifice in pursuit of reunion is justified. She's constructed an entire community that enables and reinforces her worst psychological impulses. The religious rituals around Kadu implantation are particularly disturbing from this perspective. The Kadu are parasitic organisms derived from the megamycete that Miranda implants in subjects, causing transformation that's usually horrific and often fatal. But she frames this as a religious rite, a potential honor, a chance to be elevated or to contribute to sacred purpose. The villagers who survive transformation become lichens, losing most of their humanity. Those who die are just failures, acceptable losses in the divine plan. This transforms Miranda's experimental program from what it actually is, systematic torture and murder in pursuit of impossible goal, into something that sounds noble and meaningful. The villagers aren't victims. They're participants in holy work. Their suffering isn't cruelty. It's the price of transcendence. Miranda has created a framework that makes atrocity not just acceptable, but virtuous. This is cult psychology at its most effective and most evil. Real-world cults operate on similar principles. Take vulnerable people, offer them something they desperately need, create a belief system that makes exploitation seem like elevation, position the leader as the sole source of hope and meaning. Miranda does all of this while being her own first and most devoted follower. She genuinely believes in the sacred nature of her work because she has to. Her entire psychological structure depends on resurrection being not just possible, but divinely ordained, cosmically important, worth any price. The Four Lords function as a kind of dark apostleship in this framework. They're proof of Miranda's power, examples of successful transformation, lieutenants who help manage the broader population. But they're also test subjects, experiments she's dressed up in religious and familial language to make their exploitation seem like honor. She calls them her children, positions herself as their mother, but she created them through invasive procedures without their meaningful consent and maintains their loyalty through manipulation and fear. Alcina Dimitrescu serves as example. She was dying when Miranda found her, transformed her through Kadu implantation that gave her extraordinary abilities but also created a blood disease requiring her to consume human victims. Miranda saved her life but also cursed her, made her dependent on murder for survival, and positioned herself as benefactor to whom gratitude is owed. That's not motherhood. That's creation of obligated dependence. The religious framing allows Miranda to see this relationship as loving rather than exploitative. She gave Alcina life when she was dying, gave her power and position, included her in the sacred family working toward glorious purpose. The fact that Alcina now has to kill to survive, that she's bound to Miranda's service, that she can't leave or refuse without losing everything. These are just acceptable conditions of the blessing Miranda provided. This is how abusive systems maintain themselves psychologically. The abuse is reframed as care, the exploitation as opportunity, the control as protection. And if you've internalized the framework, if you believe the religious mythology, it's hard to see the reality underneath. The Four Lords, with the exception of Heisenberg, appear to have mostly internalized it. They genuinely seem to view Miranda as mother figure despite how she's used them. That's successful cult indoctrination, making victims defend their abuser because the alternative is confronting how thoroughly they've been exploited. Miranda's cult of grief is severity level 5 in terms of psychological manipulation and social harm. It's taken her individual pathology and metastasized it into a community-wide delusion that enables ongoing atrocity. The villagers can't challenge her because to do so would be to challenge their faith, their hope of reunion with their dead, their entire understanding of the world. She's made herself psychologically indispensable by positioning herself as the sole gateway to what they most desperately want. That's brilliant and monstrous, the work of someone who understands human need precisely so she can weaponize it. The body as grief made manifest. Miranda's physical transformations throughout Village deserve psychological examination because they're visual representations of her internal state. She's not locked into a single form. She shapeshifts, takes on different appearances, shifts between human-seeming priestess and monstrous winged creature with roots and claws. This fluidity of form mirrors psychological fluidity about identity and boundaries. When we see her disguised as the old hag in the village, she's hunched and weathered, ancient and grotesque. This could be her true appearance, what a century of life has done to her body, or it could be a chosen form that reflects how she feels internally, ancient, burdened, carrying weight that's aged her beyond normal human limits. The hag form is grief personified, sorrow made physical. When she impersonates Mia, she perfectly mimics a young mother's appearance and mannerisms. This requires not just physical transformation, but psychological observation and acting ability. Miranda inhabits Mia's form and role for months, caring for infant Rose, interacting with Ethan, performing domesticity. The fact that she can do this, can convincingly mimic loving motherhood while planning to murder the infant she's caring for, demonstrates profound dissociation between performed behavior and internal state. This is someone who spent so long manipulating and performing that she can separate action from meaning entirely. She can feed and bathe Rose, sing to her, comfort her, all the behaviors of maternal care, while experiencing none of the genuine attachment those behaviors normally express. The maternal actions are just technique, mastery of a role, no different from any other form she might assume. Rose isn't a baby she's caring for. She's an experimental subject Miranda is maintaining in optimal condition until time for harvest. The final monstrous form Miranda assumes for the battle with Ethan is psychologically revealing too. She's barely humanoid, more plant than animal, roots and tendrils and wings formed from fungal matter. This is grief and obsession stripped of human disguise, transformed into something that operates by entirely non-human principles. She's become what she's always been psychologically, a force of nature driven by single purpose, no longer bound by human form or human limitation or human morality. The wing imagery is interesting. Wings traditionally symbolize transcendence, ascension, moving beyond earthly constraints. Miranda's wings are dark and ragged, formed from the mold's organic matter, but they still grant flight, still represent escape from normal physical limitations. Psychologically, she's someone who's tried to transcend human experience, specifically the human experience of mortality and permanent loss. The wings are her apotheosis, the moment where she fully embraces being something other than human in pursuit of her impossible goal. But they're also grotesque, obviously monstrous rather than gloriously angelic. This reflects the reality of what transcendence through denial has made her. She's not elevated. She's degraded. She hasn't overcome human limitations. She's lost human qualities like empathy and moral consideration while gaining power that lets her act on her worst impulses without constraint. The monstrous form is the truth her various disguises usually hide. She's become something that looks like it might have once been human, but has transformed into something else entirely, something driven by obsession rather than feeling, by need rather than care. There's also the symbolic importance of the roots. While she has wings that reach upward, she also has roots that dig down, that anchor her to the earth, and specifically to the megamycete beneath it. She's bound to the source of her power, can't separate herself from it, has become integrated into the fungal network. Psychologically, she's rooted in her grief, unable to move beyond it, eternally connected to the moment of loss no matter how much time passes or how far she reaches with her ambitions. The shape-shifting itself, the lack of fixed form, suggests identity diffusion. Miranda doesn't have a stable sense of self. She's whoever she needs to be to achieve her goal. Priestess, hag, mother, monster, the forms shift but the purpose remains constant. This is someone whose identity has collapsed into single-minded pursuit, where the question, "Who am I?" has only one answer: I am the one who will resurrect Eva. Everything else is just costume, just temporary form assumed for strategic purposes. This is body dysmorphia on existential scale, where your physical form is completely disconnected from any stable sense of embodied self. Severity level 4, because she maintains enough coherence to function and plan, but she's lost the normal human experience of having a body that feels like yours, that expresses who you are. Her body is tool and weapon and disguise, never just the physical manifestation of a person living in the world. Legacy of destruction. As we approach the end of this analysis, we need to examine what Miranda left behind, because the scope of destruction reveals the full psychological cost of her century-long campaign. The village is decimated, its population transformed or killed. The four lords are dead, killed by Ethan or destroyed when Miranda no longer needs them. The Megamycetes network is damaged when Ethan uses the explosives to destroy it. Rose is traumatized by her kidnapping and dismemberment, even if she's too young to consciously remember. Mia loses her husband, has to raise Rose alone with the knowledge of what was done to them. The BSAA forces sent to intervene are mostly killed. Even Miranda herself is destroyed, failing to achieve her goal after more than 100 years of effort. The body count is staggering when you actually calculate it. Hundreds of villagers over the decades transformed into lichens or killed in failed experiments. The Baker family and everyone who encountered Eveline, the BSAA team, the four lords and everyone in their domains, all the victims Alcina killed for blood, all the people Moreau drowned, all the subjects Heisenberg experimented on, all the victims of Donna's pollen and Angie's violence. Multiple generations of suffering, entire family lines ended, a community's culture destroyed, and all of it, every single death and transformation and moment of suffering was completely pointless. Miranda never achieves resurrection. Eva is never brought back. Rose survives and escapes. The goal Miranda pursued for over a century, that she justified every atrocity in service of, remains impossible at the end as it was at the beginning. She learned nothing, saved no one, accomplished nothing beyond destruction and her own eventual death. This is the ultimate psychological tragedy of obsessive goal pursuit, disconnected from reality testing. If Miranda had been capable of accepting feedback, of learning from repeated failure, of adjusting her approach, or abandoning impossible goals, she could have stopped at any point in the 100 years. After 10 years of failed experiments, a psychologically healthy person would reassess. After 50 years, anyone with normal reality testing would accept that the approach isn't working. After a century, even the most stubborn would acknowledge futility, but Miranda couldn't do any of that because the goal had become her entire identity. Accepting that resurrection was impossible would mean accepting that she wasted her life, that Ava's death was meaningless, that she became a monster for nothing. That kind of realization would shatter her psychological structure completely. So she had to keep believing, keep trying, Keep insisting that success was just around the next corner. The sunk cost fallacy amplified to life-destroying proportions. This is what makes her psychologically distinct from villains who are purely sadistic or power-hungry. Miranda doesn't want to hurt people for pleasure. She doesn't want domination for its own sake. She wants something understandable, even sympathetic, her child back, her loss reversed, her grief resolved. It's a goal that almost anyone can understand on emotional level, which makes her actions somehow more disturbing because we can see the recognizable human motivation underneath the monstrous behavior. She's what grief becomes when it's never processed, when power removes normal constraints, when intelligence is bent entirely toward denying reality rather than accepting it. She's the mother who can't let go, transformed into nightmare over the course of a century, and that makes her more psychologically realistic and more disturbing than if she were just evil incarnate. The legacy question extends beyond just body count, too. What did Miranda's existence mean? What did her century of effort create beyond death? She advanced understanding of the mold and bioweapon potential, knowledge that organizations like the Connections exploited to create Eveline and probably other weapons. She proved that extended life and consciousness preservation might be possible, raising questions about death and identity that humanity isn't ready to grapple with. She demonstrated what happens when scientific capability outpaces ethical consideration, when power is pursued without wisdom. But these aren't positive legacies. They're warnings, examples of paths humanity shouldn't follow. Miranda's story is a cautionary tale about grief that refuses resolution, about love that curdles into obsession, about intelligence without empathy, about power without constraint. Everything she touched was corrupted or destroyed. Everyone who encountered her was worse off for the meeting. She made the world darker, crueler, more dangerous, and achieved nothing of value in exchange. This is nihilistic legacy, severity level 5. Her existence ultimately meant nothing beyond the suffering it caused. She mattered to herself. Her grief and goal felt cosmically important from inside her perspective. But from outside, from the view of history and broader human experience, she's just another cautionary tale about the dangers of refusing to accept limitation and loss. The narcissistic void. Throughout this analysis, I've referenced Miranda's narcissism repeatedly, but we need to examine it more directly now because it's the core psychological structure that enabled everything else. Miranda displays what psychologists call malignant narcissism, grandiosity, need for admiration, lack of empathy, combined with paranoia, aggression, and sadism. This is severity level 5 narcissistic pathology, as extreme as it gets without complete loss of functional coherence. The grandiosity appears in her self-positioning as divine figure, in her belief that her goals justify any means, in her assumption that she's operating on a different moral plane than ordinary people. She genuinely believes she's special, elevated, more important than others. The villagers' worship confirms this belief, creates feedback loop where their reverence proves her superiority, which justifies demanding more reverence and sacrifice. The need for admiration shows in how she treats the four lords. She created them partly to have powerful servants, but also to have children who would adore her, look up to her, validate her importance. Moreau's desperate seeking of approval, Donna's loyalty, even Alcina's respect, all of it feeds Miranda's narcissistic need to be seen as an extraordinary mother figure. The fact that Heisenberg rebels threatens her not just tactically, but psychologically, challenges the narrative that she's such a magnificent leader that everyone naturally wants to serve her. The lack of empathy is pervasive and severe. Miranda appears genuinely incapable of experiencing others' suffering as real or important. She can intellectually understand that people are in pain, can even predict and manipulate emotional responses, but she doesn't feel their pain as something that matters. Other people's inner lives don't exist for her in any meaningful sense. They're objects that sometimes behave in ways she needs to account for, not subjects with experiences that have moral weight. This is what psychologists call low affective empathy combined with intact or even heightened cognitive empathy. She can read people, understand their motivation and vulnerabilities, model their likely responses. That's cognitive empathy, the intellectual understanding of others' mental states. But she doesn't feel with them, doesn't experience emotional resonance with their suffering or joy. That's the affective empathy deficit, and it's what allows her to torture and kill without experiencing appropriate guilt or hesitation. The paranoia appears in her surveillance of the village, her need to control information and movement, her distrust of anyone who might challenge her. She positions herself as sole source of truth and authority, uses the black god cult framework to ensure ideological conformity, punishes or eliminates anyone who questions her too, directly. This isn't just strategic caution, it's paranoid need to control the narrative because any challenge to her authority triggers deep narcissistic injury. The aggression and sadism show in how she treats failed experiments and anyone who opposes her. She doesn't just kill cleanly, she transforms people into lichens, leaving them trapped in monstrous forms. She keeps Moreau in state of degradation while denying him the acceptance that might ease his suffering. She plans to dismember infant Rose and distribute her body parts as punishment for Ethan's interference. These aren't efficient solutions. They're expressions of rage at anyone who gets in her way, punishment for daring to challenge or complicate her goals. At the core of narcissistic personality structure is what psychologists call the narcissistic void, profound inner emptiness that demands constant external validation to fill. Healthy people develop internal sense of worth based on genuine relationships, accomplishments, values lived out in daily behavior. Narcissists lack this internal foundation and depend entirely on external validation to feel real, important, worthwhile. Miranda's narcissistic void is catastrophic in scale. Eva's death didn't just take her daughter. It removed the primary source of narcissistic supply, the relationship that made Miranda feel important and needed and successful as person. Without Eva, she had nothing. No internal resources, no other relationships that mattered, no sense of self that could survive the loss. So she filled the void with the resurrection goal, with worship from villagers, with power and control and the grandiose belief that she could overcome death itself. But you can't actually fill the narcissistic void with external things because it's an internal problem. No amount of power or worship or achievement can create the stable sense of self that should have developed through secure early attachments and healthy psychological development. Miranda could rule 1,000 villages, could successfully resurrect Eva, could become an actual goddess, and she'd still have that empty place at her core because the emptiness isn't about external circumstances, it's about fundamental deficit in psychological structure. This is why she's never satisfied, never quite successful enough, never able to stop pursuing more. Each failed experiment should provide information that accumulation of failures means the approach is wrong, but she can't integrate that feedback because stopping would mean confronting the void. As long as she's pursuing resurrection, she has purpose and meaning and justification for her existence. If she stops, she has to face the emptiness directly, has to acknowledge that she has no stable identity beyond the goal, and that realization would be psychologically annihilating. The tragedy is that the only thing that might have helped Miranda develop beyond her narcissistic void was exactly what she refused to do: genuinely process Ava's death, work through the grief, build new relationships and meanings, develop identity beyond just being Ava's mother. But that path required accepting loss and vulnerability, required admitting she wasn't all powerful and couldn't control everything, required being ordinary human dealing with ordinary human grief. And her narcissistic structure couldn't tolerate that level of woundedness and limitation. So she chose the other path: deny the loss, pursue impossible reversal, become powerful enough that vulnerability can't touch her, elevate herself above ordinary human experience. This protected her from confronting the void directly, but also ensured she'd never actually heal, never develop beyond the frozen state of grief and narcissistic injury. She survived in one sense, maintained psychological functioning across a century, but she never actually lived in any meaningful way. She just endured, waiting for the resurrection that never came. Conclusion: The monster. Grief makes Mother Miranda is one of the most psychologically complex villains in survival horror, because she's what happens when understandable human emotion meets catastrophic psychological pathology and supernatural power. She starts from a place everyone can relate to: parental grief over a child's death, but her specific psychological makeup, her narcissistic structure, her inability to accept limitation, her access to the megamycete, all of it combined to transform normal grief into century-long campaign of atrocity. She displays multiple severe psychological pathologies simultaneously: arrested grief development at severity level 5, where the mourning process never progressed beyond initial shock and denial; God complex at severity level 4 approaching 5, where she genuinely believes normal moral rules don't apply to her; dehumanization at severity level 5, where other people simply don't register as having meaningful inner lives; narcissistic pathology at severity level 5, with grandiosity, lack of empathy, and paranoid need for control; temporal dissociation at severity level 4, where her subjective experience of time stopped in 1919 and never resumed normal progression; pathological love at severity level 5, where maternal devotion curdled into obsession that justified any atrocity. The combination creates someone who's simultaneously sympathetic and monstrous, understandable and alien. We can trace how she got from grieving mother to nightmare, can see the psychological trajectory that led from Ava's death to planning Rose's murder. That trajectory is psychologically realistic, even though the supernatural elements aren't. Real people display these same patterns in less extreme forms: the inability to accept loss, the obsessive pursuit of impossible goals, the narcissistic injury that demands reality conform to needs, the intellectualization that allows emotional disconnection from consequences. Miranda is those tendencies taken to absolute extremes, amplified by century of time and access to power that removes normal constraints. She's what grief becomes when it's never processed, when narcissism prevents healthy acceptance, when intelligence is bent entirely toward denying reality. She's cautionary tale about refusing to accept what cannot be changed, about letting single trauma define entire existence, about how love itself can become monstrous when it's really about the lover's needs rather than the beloved's well-being. Her death accomplishes nothing meaningful because her life accomplished nothing beyond destruction. She sought to bring back one child and in the process destroyed hundreds. She claimed to love Ava, but dishonored her memory with every atrocity committed in her name. She positioned herself as mother, but perverted everything motherhood represents, becoming predator, wearing maternal mask. She lived for over a century, but never grew, never changed, never moved beyond the single frozen moment when her daughter died, and something in her died with her. In the end, Mother Miranda's psychological profile is portrait of what happens when we refuse to accept loss, when we demand that reality give us back what it's taken, when we let grief transform into something that destroys rather than honors what was lost. She's the dark possibility that exists in every parent's grief, the temptation to burn the world rather than accept that your child is gone. Most people don't follow that path because normal constraints prevent it, because psychological health allows grief processing, because empathy makes others' suffering feel real and important enough to prevent atrocity. But Miranda had supernatural power that removed constraints, had narcissistic pathology that prevented healthy grief processing, had empathy deficit that made other suffering irrelevant, and so she followed the path to its ultimate conclusion, became the monster that grief makes when everything that would normally stop it is stripped away. Her story is horror not because it's unrealistic, but because it's the logical extreme of something entirely human, something we can all recognize, even as we recoil from what she became. She matters as villain not because she's powerful or frightening, though she's both, but because she shows us what we could become if our worst moments, our deepest griefs, our most selfish impulses were allowed to define us completely across time, unlimited by normal human lifespan. She's the shadow of parental love, the nightmare version of maternal devotion. Grief is plague that spreads and consumes everything it touches. She's what happens when we can't let go, when acceptance is psychologically impossible, when we'd rather become monsters than admit we're powerless against mortality. And that makes her psychologically fascinating, tragic, and ultimately more disturbing than any simple sadist could be, because she loved her daughter. She really did. And that love destroyed her, and everyone around her turned her into exactly the kind of catastrophe that took Ava in the first place. She became death while claiming to fight it, became destroyer of families while claiming to value family above all, became everything she should have opposed in Eva's name. That's the ultimate psychological horror of Mother Miranda. She's what love looks like when it refuses to accept loss, when it demands impossible reversal, when it cares more about the lover's needs than the beloved's memory or anyone else's well-being. She's maternal devotion stripped of everything that makes it healthy and beautiful, leaving only obsessive need and willingness to destroy anything that stands between her and her goal. She's the monster grief makes when grief is allowed to define everything for over a century, with no constraint and no growth and no acceptance. She died as she lived, reaching for daughter she could never touch, refusing until the final moment to accept what everyone else knows from the beginning. You can't bring back the dead, and trying to do so only creates more death, more grief, more families destroyed by the very love that should protect them. Her century of effort achieved nothing but proving that some losses can't be reversed, some griefs can't be resolved through action, some loves become poison when they refuse to transform into memory and meaning. Mother Miranda is what happens when we won't let go, when we can't move forward, when we insist that our pain is so special, so important, so cosmically significant that anything is justified in trying to undo it. She's the voice that whispers in every grieving parent's worst moments, burn the world, take what you need, your suffering matters more than anything, and she's the nightmare that results when someone actually listens to that voice and has the power and time and lack of empathy to follow it to its conclusion. She's the mother who couldn't let her daughter rest, couldn't honor her by living well and doing good, couldn't accept that Ava's life meant something even though it ended too soon. Instead, she made Ava's death mean everything and therefore nothing, justification for atrocity that ultimately dishonored the child she claimed to love above all. That's the final psychological assessment of Mother Miranda. She loved her daughter so much she destroyed everything that love should have protected. So much she became the thing that should have horrified her most. So much that love itself became unrecognizable as anything but hunger and obsession and need. And perhaps that's the most important psychological insight. Love alone isn't enough. Love without acceptance becomes obsession. Love without empathy becomes predation. Love without the ability to let go becomes the cage that traps everyone it touches. Miranda had love in abundance, had devotion and determination and willingness to sacrifice, but she didn't have wisdom, didn't have acceptance, didn't have the psychological flexibility to transform grief into meaning rather than demanding literal resurrection. So she destroyed everything and achieved nothing and died alone reaching for a child who was never coming back, who probably wouldn't have wanted to return to a mother who'd become a monster in her name. That's the tragedy and the horror of Mother Miranda. She had a century to become something better, and instead became only more of what she already was: grief and narcissism and refusal to accept reality, frozen in single moment of loss until that loss became her entire existence and eventually her death. She's the answer to the question, what happens when grief never ends, when mourning becomes eternal, when a mother's love refuses to accept that death is final? The answer is Mother Miranda, monster made of grief, deity made of denial, mother made of obsession. She's what we must not become, what we must not let our losses transform us into, no matter how deep the pain or how impossible acceptance seems. Because in the end, after all the suffering and death and century of effort, Ava stayed dead, and Miranda joined her, and all that remained was the wreckage of lives destroyed by love that couldn't let go. That's the final word on Mother Miranda's psychology. She spent over 100 years proving that some things can't be controlled or reversed or undone through will and power and refusal to accept limitation. She proved it by destroying herself and everyone around her while insisting until her final breath that success was possible, resurrection was achievable, her goal was righteous, and her methods justified. She was wrong, and the trail of bodies behind her is the evidence of that wrongness. The cost of narcissism and grief combined with power and time and absolute refusal to accept what cannot be changed. She's the monster grief makes when everything that should stop it fails, and her story is warning written in blood and fungus and wasted lives. Let go, accept loss, honor the dead by living well, or risk becoming the very thing that destroyed what you love.